The Trigun manga has been adapted twice, but both are very different stories that vary wildly from the source material. So in this video, I'm going to compare the works to each other, factually showing in which ways they differ, and explaining what I think each one does best with the way it takes its story. This is not an exhaustive list of every difference between them, as that is nearly everything, but I will go over how the general story was changed, as well as specific changes that stood out to me while reading the manga and watching both anime series. Where else to start except the beginning? The original 1998 anime begins with the bounty hunters attacking Vash, the dangerous gunman with $60 billion double dollars on his head. Millie and Meryl are introduced by walking into a bar and ordering ice cream and tea, and an ongoing joke of no one believing that Vash is really Vash begins here with a showdown between multiple bounty hunters who mistake each other for the legendary outlaw. The manga starts with a similar concept, however, it actually begins with the arc that is adapted in episode 5 of the 90s anime. Several gunmen walk into a restaurant and shoot up the place, hoping to get Vash's bounty. They think they got him after he spilled ketchup on himself, but he gets up and humiliates their attempt on his life. This is immediately followed by the townspeople turning on him so they can claim the reward to fix their plan, which then leads to the final showdown with the Nebraska family. The introduction of Millie and Meryl is the same in both of these. Besides that, the first anime episode is completely filler by the manga standpoint. The ongoing joke of nobody believing who Vash really is not in the manga at all, although I did like how it played through the first episodes, with a payoff of Meryl finally admitting that Vash is Vash in episode 5. This also means that those first 4 episodes do not appear in the manga, except for episode 4, which is an adaptation of the original test pilot for the series. It's technically not part of the canon, but it's a very self-contained story, so it can really fit in no problem. It's almost exactly the same, except Meryl and Millie don't appear in the chapter. However, it still has the classic love and peace. Finally, there are a few small differences in episode 5 to the opening chapter of the manga. Love and peace isn't mentioned here, the Nebraskas never target the injured women, and Millie is actually the one who defeats the Nebraska father. Also, the people stop attacking Vash because the government voided the bounty on his head, because they put him in the category of a literal typhoon, which Meryl reveals to the townspeople. And this is why this won't be an exhaustive list of every change, because there are millions of them. And in the case of Trigun Stampede, almost everything is changed. Speaking of Trigun Stampede, I've heard many people say that Trigun Stampede is more accurate to the manga, but this is completely false. It takes things from the manga, but it only follows it in the vaguest sense. It begins with the Project Seed ship going down, and sets up Knives immediately, which is saved as a mystery for later in both the manga and 90s anime, although the circumstances of the backstory are more accurate to the manga's version of things. I'll get into that later. Then we see Meryl and Roberto. Millie is absent from the first season of Trigun Stampede because they chose to make Stampede a prequel style story, but contrary to what people are saying, this is not a prequel to the 90s anime or manga. It does not fit at all. This is an entirely new story in a new world, which you'll see as we go further into the comparisons. With that out of the way, Roberto is a brand new character that is a reporter for the Bernadelli news agency with his new rookie, Meryl Strife. This is a reference to the very end of the Trigun manga, where Meryl and Millie become reporters after the insurance agency shuts down because humanity nearly goes extinct. Yeah, the manga kinda goes off the rails. The only reason Vash has a bounty in the manga is because of the July incident, whereas here, he has been framed for stealing plants because July hasn't been destroyed yet. The first episode has nearly nothing from the manga, but the rest of the arc follows multiple storylines and mashes them together. The village has a problem with their plant, so they turn on Vash for the bounty, and also the Nebraska family shows up, same as 90s anime episode 5 and the manga. However, this is also taking place at Genora Rock, which is where Vash fights Dominique the Cyclops in the anime, and in the manga, it's where Knives is resurrected and where Vash uses his angel arm for the second time, which is a huge turning point for the story. This vaguely corresponds to episode 3 of Stampede, where there is also a big turning point, but it is a completely different situation with Knives stealing plants and destroying the entire city. The city was not destroyed in the manga, but everyone in town was pretty freaked out that he shot a crater in the moon. E.G. Mine appears in this arc as well. He appears later in the manga and much later in the 90s anime. Much like the other adaptations, he is an extremely minor villain, although he probably gets the most screen time here. Of each one, Stampede sets up the most different story by its drastically different first arc. While both the 90s anime and manga start a little slower and take time to set up the showdowns with the gung-ho guns and the eventual reveal of Knives, Stampede goes straight into showing Knives at full power and his goal of stealing plants. How the middle of the plot continues from here is different, but also somewhat similar with each one. The 90s anime continues up to 19, with about half of the episodes being close adaptations of the manga. However, it is is completely out of order and often in different locations. The manga goes from the first introduction arc into the Sand Steamer arc that plays out almost exactly like the 90s anime. From there, it goes directly into Little Arcadia, which is where the rest of the Nebraska family is introduced. This is the arc about a land dispute over an oasis. I was the most surprised that this was a manga arc, as it was one of my least favorite from the anime, but it's given a little more time in the manga and it feels a lot better. Right after that, Vash meets Legato, and we start to get more into the meat of the first major part of the story. He fights Mon of the Gale, very similarly to the anime, but after this is where the manga and anime split a little more drastically. To give an idea about how little of the story was adapted in the 90s anime, it follows the story fairly accurately up to Mon of the Gale, which ends on Volume 2, Chapter 3. Then the anime takes parts of the manga, such as Legato killing the thugs in the bar, and the second time a sand steamer got held up. You know, the episode where total slaughter was sung. With these later parts of the story, the main plot is about the same from manga to anime. However, small details and a lot of things around it were changed as they set up different endings. So in all, the 90s anime adapts a little over 3 volumes worth of source material. The manga has a total of 16 volumes. The episodic feel to the anime is non-existent in the manga, where everything flows together really smoothly. The general plot in the middle section of the story is about the same in each iteration. Vash fights through the gung-ho guns until he eventually faces down against Legato and finally Knives. The 90s anime speed runs the gung-ho guns as it finished with very little of the original story available to adapt, but the manga takes its time to make each battle a much bigger deal, and this is the main part of the middle section of it. Interspersed with these battles are the backstories of characters like Vash, Knives, and Wolfwood, while it also builds up the world, all coming together for the final fight against Knives. Stampede does more or less the same thing, but in a completely different way and much faster. It's also only half completed, so it's hard to fully compare the middle of the story when we don't fully know what the middle even is. This could have a movie to finish it, or a full season or two. We just don't know yet. However, there is a lot of references to the manga in these 12 episodes. We'll be getting into these details along with others from the 90s anime now. First, I want to go over the biggest moments throughout the series, besides the ending. The first major turning point in the story for the manga is in Jinora Rock, as I mentioned earlier, but let's get into the details of that situation and compare it to the major turning points in both of the anime. Although in different ways, all 3 stories have Knives shot and nearly killed by Vash's angel arm in the July incident. Stampede hasn't yet confirmed that he survived. In the manga, while he recovers from injuries after defeating Dominique the Cyclops, he senses Knives being reborn. He rushes to the top of Jinora Rock to find most of the gung-ho guns and Knives having just been resurrected by a plant who died in the process of his rebirth. Vash points his gun at Knives, who mocks him for not changing after all this time. Vash lost his memories from the July incident, so Knives grabs him and reminds him how to use his angel arm, hoping for him to kill the humans of Jinora Rock. Vash can't totally control it, so he aims in the sky and hits the 5th moon, leaving a massive crater. For this turning point, the manga is vastly superior to both of the anime's plot points. The 90s anime has a similar situation, although in the city of Augustus, and it's not Knives who activates Vash's angel arm, it's Legato. Also, this is when he fights Raide the Blade. His battle with the samurai is a bit later in the manga. It's still an incredible moment, but the manga sets up so much more by showing Knives and the major threat that he is. It's so much more meaningful. The first turning point in Stampede is the destruction of Jinora Rock. It happens very suddenly in the 3rd episode, so there wasn't as much build-up and time for this moment to be as powerful to me. However, it was still an incredible spectacle, as Million Knives lives up to his name with a million knives. It's the most different from the others, as Knives is in his prime and already stealing plants. It's also much more tragic and over the top compared to the more personal struggles of the others. Vash and Knives' backstory is an aspect that Stampede adapts very accurately. The 90s anime has this group of leaders who are in charge of taking care of the seed ship: Mary, Roland, Steve, and Joey, all sounding like the most generic English names they could come up with, along with Rem, of course. None of these characters except Rem are in the manga or Stampede. This backstory is built on the character relationships that Knives manipulates to cause chaos, which ends with him directly or indirectly killing most members of the crew. He then sabotages the ships and gets sent to an escape pod with Vash. Rem stays behind, sacrificing herself to save the fleet. The main motivation for Knives' hate of humanity was that he saw Steve being a jerk, and that his name is Knives and he's evil. But in the manga and Stampede, there's a much more understandable reason for Knives' distrust, even though he keeps his pure evil vibe that he had through all versions. Instead of the group piloting the ship, Rem is the only one in the picture for most of their upbringing on the seed ship. There are a few other crew members in stasis, and at one point a few of them wake up to stabilize the ship after Knives caused a problem, but they were nothing like the anime's version of things. Knives and Vash were born on the ship from a plant, and Rem took care of them when she wasn't supposed to. Even one crew member discovered them before he went back into stasis after repairing the ship, but he showed kindness and support to the children. It's a very tragic story, as the kindness of Rem was repaid with the near extinction of humanity. Everything seems to go well until Knives and Vash discover their older sister, Tesla. She was the first known independent plant born, so she was the victim of unending tests and experiments, which eventually killed her. The kids find her body in pieces, while still in test tubes. In the manga, it's shown that she's dead, while Stampede reveals she is still alive in this horrible state. The manga gives this a little more time and shows that Vash takes this really hard along with Knives. In fact, Vash tries to kill himself and nearly kills Rem shortly after, but through her actions, he deals with the trauma and learns to trust and forgive despite the past mistakes. Knives, however, suppresses the memories and acts as if nothing had happened until he sabotages the ship and tries to kill all the humans in stasis. Even after Rem tells him the full story after she saw he suppressed the memories, he continues to shove down the emotions. He's a really dark and tragic villain whose suppression of dealing with tragedy caused him to harbor so much hate for humanity. By far, the manga has the best backstory and gives so much understanding to Vash and Knives' character, with a really beautiful depth to the psyche of them. The 90s anime backstory also works well for the story it is trying to tell. Stampede gives the most important details about Tesla, but doesn't spend enough time to show the whole story that adds a lot to Vash and Rem's relationship. The next major moment I want to talk about is my favorite in the story, and that is the death of Nicholas D. Wolfwood. He has not yet died in Stampede, but I'm sure he will in the second part, as his death is a major part of the development of the story. Although his deaths happen in totally different situations between the manga and 90s anime, a lot of the philosophy is the same for his character arc. In the anime, we get a short gunfight where he faces down against his old teacher Chapel, who encourages him to kill, but being influenced by Vash to find the non-lethal way out of situations, he leaves Chapel alive. He ends up being shot after this. He walks back to Vash, who had been fighting a different gung-ho gun, Kane the Longshot, who is an anime-only character, by the way. Wolfwood tells Vash where Knives is, as he has been working for him this whole time. He leaves without another word to Vash, and every single line from here he speaks is a prayer. Still bleeding out, he walks into a church and laments that he didn't look for peaceful ways out of situations. He relied on death so much, and justified it through his desire to care for the children in the orphanage. He finds some redemption in the end as he clings to the cross that he had used as a weapon for so long, and confesses his sins. But in the end, he's filled with regret and the desire to stay with his friends. He dies conflicted, with so much you can draw out of his last moments. It's a beautiful and sad scene, one of the most powerful moments in the show. In the manga, the relationship between Vash and Wolfwood had gone on much longer. Halfway through the story, Vash had been captured by Knives and held hostage through Legato's power, as Knives stole most of the plants on the planet and nearly brought humanity to extinction here, but Wolfwood rescued him. After this, Wolfwood goes back to check on the orphanage, where a trap was set for him by Chapel, which is a different character in the same role as Chapel from the anime. Wolfwood was a part of an assassin cult called Eye of Michael. He had tried to kill his mentor and took his place in the gung-ho guns, hoping to kill Knives, so Chapel is obviously not too happy with him. He fights his friend Livio, who is also in the Eye of Michael, and then Chapel. As shown in Stampede, Wolfwood has these vials of healing liquid that heals him after major injuries. He is defeated in this fight, but only because he held himself back and didn't kill. Similarly to the anime, it showed the effect that Vash had on him, where he changed his philosophy and didn't rely on the deaths of others to accomplish his goals. Before Chapel kills Wolfwood in revenge, he plans to kill all the kids in the orphanage in front of the man who fought so hard to protect them. But Vash arrives and protects the children. Wolfwood manages to break free in the confusion and drinks the vials, but he drinks 2 at a time, which is extremely dangerous, but makes him nearly invincible for a time, which allows him to defeat Chapel and then pacify Livio. After the dust had cleared, the children were taken into the ship that contained the people on Vash's side, and the crew leave as Knives was approaching the area. But Wolfwood stayed behind with Vash and didn't want the kids to know that it was him, as the experiments that gave him strength and healing properties had also increased his age. He also didn't want the children he grew up with to see him as the murderer he was. Wolfwood asks Vash to have a drink with him. They sit on a couch that is still standing within all the rubble of their fights and clink their glasses together. They watch the ship fly away as confetti starts to pour out from it. The kids had plans for a party and celebration for when their brother Nico returned. The next day, Livio wakes up, having been unconscious from the fight, and Vash tells him where he buried Nicholas Wolfwood's body. The 2 vials were too much on his heart. He died to protect the children and to save Livio, even though, as Chapel had said, he was powerful enough to mercilessly kill everyone there. The manga's version of his death is on a much more fulfilling note. Wolfwood changed to be a better person, saved the children he so desperately wanted to protect, and saved his best friend growing up in the orphanage, Livio, who had suffered a similar fate of joining the cult of assassins. In the end, Wolfwood was grateful for the things he accomplished and the friends he made, especially the one he ended his life sharing a drink with. Vash the Stampede. Although the manga's ending for Wolfwood is very powerful and overall better set up and executed, I actually prefer the anime's tragic ending to his character. It had just the right amount of regret and redemption, along with a big focus on the themes of killing to survive, which the manga didn't focus as much on. In both series, Wolfwood lives on in Vash, anime, and Livio, manga, who hear his voice in moments after his death. A similar comparison between the manga and 90s anime is in Legato's death, which I won't go into as much detail about, but was still a big moment in both series. The anime has a situation in the end where Legato forces Vash to break his no-killing rule by threatening Millie and Meryl. It was really sudden, but very powerful. It hit me hard when I saw it. After this, we get Vash dealing with it, as it was the first time he legitimately killed anyone. It's hard for me to choose between this or Wolfwood's death as my favorite moment in the entire show. It was both satisfying and tragic to watch Vash shoot Legato. The manga is very similar, but with a lot more going on, and Livio is in the place of Meryl and Millie. After Wolfwood died saving Livio, Vash especially feels that he can't let his friend's sacrifice be in vain. There's not much of Vash dealing with the decision in the manga, as he is right in the middle of an extremely large climactic battle, and fights Knives not too much later. Another difference is that Legato gave a coin to each member of the Gung Ho Guns, and a case to Vash to collect them all. Once he does, it activates so that Legato can't use his power on Vash to make their fight more interesting. Now we are going to go into the characters themselves and compare how each version of the story changed them. Continuing with Legato, his involvement in Stampede is barely worth mentioning, as he is majorly pushed to the side, but he seems to have the same main character traits to the other stories. He seems more similar to the 90s anime's cold and collected character, whereas in the manga he's quite a bit more over the top and theatrical, with things like playing a game with Vash to collect all the coins. His powers differ quite a bit, as the anime took a classic telepath approach to his power, and for some reason gave him Vash's severed arm. The manga explains his powers with these tiny metal threads that he implanted into his brain that he can control at will. This power did not come from Knives, but Knives discovered him while he was being used as a sex slave, which gives Legato one of the most horrible backstories of any of the characters. None of this has really been explored in Stampede yet. One of my biggest complaints for the 90s anime was how Meryl and Millie felt very sidelined for a lot of the series near the end. They were there, but they didn't do much, and unfortunately this criticism is even more true for the manga. They do play a role, but I wish it was more consistent and more important. I think the story works really well from their point of view. Regardless, I really like both characters, and they feel like the heart of the show. The anime focuses a lot more on their relationships. For example, the side romance between Wolfwood and Millie does not exist in the manga. The girls are apart from Vash and Wolfwood for long stretches of the story. The aspect of Meryl being a tsundere is leaned into more heavily in the anime, but her feisty personality and deep care for Vash is still present. There's no romance in the manga between any of these characters. Or any characters, really. Stampede went an entirely different route. Millie will be introduced in the sequel, but Meryl is nothing like her tough, sensible counterpart in the manga. Instead, she grows into that throughout the series. Her courage of rushing into dangerous circumstances is still here, but apart from that, she's basically an entirely new character. Rem is much better in the manga, as we get the most time with her there, and we get to understand how great of a person she really is, showing real compassion and care to Knives and Vash, despite the risk of keeping them around. The 90s anime has the weakest Rem. I understood what role she played, but I never personally understood Vash's obsession. The added drama in the manga really heightened her character. Of course, she's still a major part of the motivation and themes in all three stories. Wolfwood gives off majorly different vibes in each one, despite being the same at his core. 90s Trigun doesn't give much details on his situation, so a lot has to be inferred by the audience. Him being a priest is mostly about the orphanage, and ironically enough, the assassin cult that he is a member of, but he does seem to have a real interest in God, even though he has a self-hating attitude about it. There's a lot in Wolfwood's character that's really interesting, but it would take a whole video to go over. In Stampede, they replaced Priest with him being an undertaker. His secondary job is more played off as a joke here, and it's very clear he is just an assassin, although his motivation and character qualities are still very much the same. His backstory is told quite a bit differently, but he's in a similar situation by the end of it. He acts more resigned to his situation in the manga, whereas Stampede makes him more out as a rebel. The manga also makes him much more cool, as he doesn't show as much emotional attachment to anyone, even though through his actions you can see how much he cares for characters like Livio. Livio is a huge part of the manga, and he's a major disappointment in Stampede. As it is for the first season, Livio kills himself after fighting Vash and Wolfwood on the sand steamer. Unlike his backstory in Stampede, in the manga he joins the Eye of Michael unrelated to the orphanage. Wolfwood was the only one adopted to be an assassin. Livio is not shown to be totally brainwashed in the manga, but is dedicated to the assassin cult until Wolfwood's death, after which he finds redemption. He's not robotic like in Stampede, he acts like he knows what he's doing. The other main difference is Razlo, Livio's other personality, who showcases how metal this manga gets. There are some hints to Razlo in Stampede, but he isn't shown yet. If Livio is anything like he is in the manga, he is absolutely not dead, as it takes an absurd amount of damage to do anything to him. In the manga, he ends up being a main character, taking over Wolfwood's role after he dies. Knives is a much more interesting villain in the manga and also in Stampede, which keeps his main motivations and backstory of discovering Tesla. He hates humans, and in a controlling, selfish way, he loves plants and his brother. The whole entering the other dimension and impregnating the plants part of Knives' plan was not in the manga, however merging with the plants was, and he becomes this horrifying eldritch monster that has to be defeated in the final arc. His best characteristics are not shown in the 90s anime, where he's mostly just evil and hates humans. Finally, we have to talk about Vash. Despite being dedicated to never killing, manga Vash is intense. He has a kind of fire and real anger that is never quite shown in the other series. There's glimpses of it in the 90s anime, but it focused much more on his goofy, happy side. He always has this more quippy, fun-loving side in the manga, but he becomes more and more serious as the story goes on. In Stampede, he's made to be more idealistic. He runs from most fights and is even more pacifist than he is in the others, which often leads to a lot of people dying around him. He lacks that fire and anger from watching people die, and just has this deep sadness, which he doesn't really hide. Overall, I think Vash is one of the most changed aspects from the source material. This may also have to do with it being a prequel story, so perhaps he will turn into more of the funny, intense, wise, and tough character he is in the manga. The next thing I want to cover is how each series builds its world, and the differences between them. The overall setting of Gunsmoke / No Man's Land, the planet of Trigun, it's a mix of old technology and futuristic devices, which is mostly the same for each one, but quite a lot of details are different or told in a different way. To start out, the manga is very clear from the beginning that humanity crashed on this planet, and 7 cities were developed around the plant ships that crashed, one of these being July. The July incident was such a big deal because Vash practically destroyed a 1/7 of the world in one night. The 90s anime made it so no one died directly from Vash's angel arm, but in the manga and Stampede, he killed most of the people of July. In the manga, it's even more tragic, as he had befriended many people there before Knives arrived, activated Vash's angel arm, and killed them all. A small change in the 90s anime was the guns being the catalyst for their angel arm power, whereas in the manga, it's just because they're plants that they have this ability. Also, Knives can't make the kind of powerful death implosion laser bomb thing Vash can, but he can make a giant freaking knife. It's quite a bit different in Stampede, where he has like millions of knives circling him, but it has a similar function. Stampede doesn't fully explain how their powers work yet, but I assume it's the same as it is in the manga. An aspect from the manga that isn't shown in either of the anime adaptations is that the angel powers are not unlimited. Both Vash and Knives have a clock, as the more they use their powers, the more their hair turns black, before they will eventually run out of energy and die. Other random world building points are, Earth was still livable in the manga, and other people from Earth arrive near the end of the story. It gives the impression that Earth was mostly stripped of its resources, but it's not like they killed the planet. The Eye of Michael were a separate group who were enlisted to help Knives, whereas Stampede had the Gung-Ho Guns and the Priest all very connected, presumably to save time. While the Gung-Ho Guns seem very loyal to Knives in both anime adaptations, quite a few of them plot against him and go against his wishes for personal reasons in the manga. William Conrad, the scientist who helps Knives understand the plants, has a very minor role in the manga, where he reveals that using the angel power will kill independent plants after their hair turns completely black. He hid this from Knives until a moment where his hair starts turning black to get him to stop his crusade and live a normal life. Knives kills him for it. The next thing to cover is the general vibes of the story. This is where each one took very different approaches. In most aspects, the 90s anime went one direction, Stampede took the exact opposite approach, and the manga is generally somewhere in the middle. Trigun Stampede was extremely dark in tone and in the events that happened. 90s Trigun was very lighthearted with some darker moments, and the manga was very dark, but also had a lot of comedy and lighter moments throughout the series. The 90s anime going for a more lighthearted tone makes sense, tense, as the earlier chapters of Trigun were much less intense, but the story progressively gets darker as Knives becomes more prominent. One example of the difference in how the story feels is in Vash's fight with Manav the Gale. The manga and 90s anime are very similar in how the fight plays out, but there are some differences that really showcase how much more intense the manga is. At the end of the fight, Manav is on the ground after killing a bunch of people in the street, and Vash has his gun to his face. In the manga, Vash actually gouges out Manav's eye from the pressure he put on his weapon. Shortly after this, when Vash fights E.G. Mine outside of town, he finds Manav crucified. Like, not just hung on a building as in the 90s anime, he is pierced through his chest and arms with a bunch of nails and hung on a cross. Although the manga and anime have the same circumstances, even though the time and place is different, the manga has a more intense brutality and darker visuals. Stampede takes the most different approach to this fight, going for a more emotional and tragic story, as Manav was a sick child that was taken from his village by the Eye of Michael, who did experiments on him and turned him into the monster that Vash had to fight. Although the design was somewhat similar, the name from the original is never used, so he's basically an entirely new character. Stampede is the most serious, with very few comedic moments. It connects everything together very closely, so the characters have personal connections to the situation or whoever they are fighting. The manga contains this somewhat, but not as much as Stampede, as it also builds the world to feel much more vast. The 90s anime has the least amount of connected narrative, which is one of its weakest aspects. The 90s anime takes the approach of a western with old-fashioned duels and gunfights, whereas Stampede takes notes more from the manga, where it's more of an action story with big over-the-top fights against monsters who take a ton of punishment to be killed. Next, I have a bunch of small details that I'm going to go over because they are really interesting but don't really fit anywhere else in the video. The gunsmith from episode 3 of the 90s anime has the same last name as a gunsmith in the manga. He's also an alcoholic, but his name is Brandon Marlin instead of the anime's Frank Marlin. It could be seen as they are father and son, as there is a line Brandon gives about his father being stone cold sober, which could be a subtle joke about the anime's Frank Marlin. Not totally sure though. The moment of Wolfwood killing in front of Vash happens in each story. 90s anime had him killing Zaze the Beast, who looks like a child. In the manga, he executes Raide the Blade, and in Stampede, he kills Rollo, the new fill-in for Manav the Gale. All of them play out similarly, with Vash being very upset at Wolfwood. The 90s anime made the biggest deal out of it, but it was a very important moment in the manga as well that is called back to throughout the series. The main villain of the first episode of the 90s anime, Descartes, is a character in the later part of the manga, although he was already captured and only shows up for one chapter where he is killed by gung-ho guns. So the anime's first episode was kind of a cool backstory for an extremely minor side character. Next, I want to say that Knives' dumb little hoodie thing in Stampede is really dumb. I hate it. It's super lame and it's a totally original design. I don't know what they were thinking, but it made it really hard to take him seriously. Roberto, also in Stampede, is named after Robert De Niro, as Roberto's full name is Roberto De Niro. Just wanted to mention that. Also, although he is an original character, there was a mentor character who gave Meryl her signature Derringers in a short flashback during the manga. I was hoping Roberto would say something along the lines of "its power is sufficient," as the character in the manga did, but unfortunately it didn't fit the story. If you haven't seen Stampede, Roberto gives Meryl his Derringers at his death. Now, how else to end the video except by comparing the endings? Trigun Stampede's ending was pretty interesting, as it revealed this was kind of a prequel story. He fights Knives and eventually destroys July, giving himself the $60 billion double dollar bounty that he starts with in the other series. Even the name of the episode, High Noon at July, is shared with Chapter 0 of the manga, a short prelude to the beginning of the story. Meryl, now a more experienced reporter, is assigned a new rookie named Millie Thompson, and Knives is very, very badly injured. I've seen this twice before, there's no way he's dead. Perhaps I will compare the real ending of the series to the manga when it comes out. The 90s anime has a very sudden ending. After Wolfwood reveals where Knives is, and Vash deals with killing Legato, he finds Knives chilling in an oasis. The fight that ensues has some cool moments. Vash using his angel arm to cancel out Knives's, the equal and opposite skill they have, and of course Vash using Wolfwood's Punisher to turn the tide of the battle. It's all pretty cool, although a little half-baked after witnessing the manga and Stampede's version of things. With the little build-up, the fight wasn't really earned. Knives was a very one-dimensional villain, and it all ended very suddenly. It wasn't a terrible ending for what they had to work with, but it was overshadowed by Legato and Wolfwood's deaths, which were much more powerful moments to me. Compared to the anime adaptations, the manga ending is absurd in scope. First, some setup. Knives has merged with a bunch of plants and became this eldritch abomination, piloting a giant ship and stealing more plants on their way to extinguish humanity. With nearly every city losing their plants, which is the only way they could survive on this barren planet, humanity was gathered together at the last hospitable city, while Knives made his way there to gather the last of the plants and then leave humanity to die. At the same time, other independent plants and people were arriving from Earth. A group on the planet were trying to communicate with the plants connected to Knives, while another group of soldiers were just trying to blow the heck out of him, which hadn't worked before. Meanwhile, Vash is also there, trying to end this conflict without casualties. There's a lot of complex things that happen in this battle, but in the end, the plants are broken off from Knives through some effort of Vash's and the will of the plants themselves. They fall to the surface, and the humans rush to save the lives of the creatures they have been depending on for their survival for this long. This leads to the final confrontation of Vash and Knives. Vash wants to end the fighting, but Knives is too prideful in his beliefs to give up. He expects to be killed in this fight and seems to accept his fate, but their fight is interrupted by another independent plant who arrived from Earth and attempted to kill them. Vash tries to fly away with his brother, but he is very injured, so Knives ends up carrying the burden and gets them out of there. At the very end, Knives' love for his brother outmatched his hatred for humanity. He found a church and begged the people there to save Vash. He finishes his life by using the last of his power to make an apple tree so that they would have some extra food. As predicted by the scientist William Conrad, Knives evaporates. Despite the major events that happened in the world, the story ends with Vash in the same situation that he was in the beginning. He had disappeared for a half a year, laying low at the church, but eventually the Earth Federation forces and bounty hunters had tracked him down. He was supposed to sneak out quietly, but because the Federation forces were about to shoot up the place, he revealed himself and then planned to run away, disguising himself and living a peaceful life. Then Millie and Meryl showed up. The now news reporters revealed Vash's existence to the whole world. We see people from the past who were affected and saved by Vash the Stampede, including Livio carrying Wolfwood's Punisher in front of the kids from the orphanage. Vash laughs at his misfortune and runs away from the many pursuers and on to his next adventure. This is by far the best ending. You can't truly appreciate the full story of Trigun without reading the manga. If this video does well, I really hope it inspires people to check out the original work by Yasuhiro Naitao, as it is an extremely unique and fascinating story. It's not only a good read by itself, but gave me more appreciation to the anime adaptations of it. Please go check it out. That's all for me in the longest video I've ever made. I really hope you enjoyed it. It was a lot of work. Let me know what your favorite parts of Trigun in the comments are, or which version of the story is your favorite. That's all for me. More videos on the end screen. Jam meow.